The grand chamber's crystal dome loomed overhead, its usual sparkle dulled by the heavy atmosphere below. 500 alien diplomats sat in perfect rings, their combined breathing creating an eerie whisper that bounced off the ancient walls. Ambassador Blake stood straight-backed in the center circle, her plain black uniform a stark contrast to the flowing robes around her. Her eyes never left Kronos as he gripped the edges of his podium, his scaled fingers leaving tiny scratches in the polished surface. "The charges stand," Kronos announced, his deep voice echoing. Disruption of civilizational harmony through seditious actions against the Concordat. Blake's laugh cut through the silence like a knife. "Harmony? Is that what you call keeping 97 species in technological darkness?" She pulled out a data chip, holding it high. "We've collected testimonies from every corner of your empire. The Drachnid suppressed fusion drives, the Melrathis banned neural networks. Should I go on?" Thanatos' recording crystals hummed as they captured every word. In the upper tiers, representatives shifted uncomfortably. "Your species," Kronos growled, "was meant to know its place." "That's your first mistake," Blake shot back. "Thinking threats would make us bow down. Earth doesn't bow. We never have." Their eyes locked in a silent battle. For the first time in 3 centuries of judging, Kronos felt something he hadn't expected. Doubt. The voting lights flickered across the chamber. One by one, they turned red. Kronos' voice carried a weight he hadn't intended as he spoke the words. "Ambassador Blake, you are hereby sentenced to death. Guards, take her." 2 armored figures moved forward, but Blake didn't flinch. She stood tall, a slight smile playing at her lips as they approached. As the chamber doors sealed behind her, Blake walked with measured steps, her fate already sealed. The murmurs of the high chamber faded into the sterile quiet of the detention wing. Outside, the vast Concordat Plaza loomed, the execution platform a grim silhouette against the towering spires. Theos tightened his grip on his recorder. History had not ended here, it had only begun. The holding cell's stark white walls seemed to pulse with the beating of Blake's heart. Through the shimmering energy field, she watched guards approach in perfect formation, their ceremonial armor gleaming under harsh lights. Their heavy boots made no sound on the polished floor. They'd been trained well. "It's time," the lead guard said, deactivating the barrier with a wave of his hand. The hum of energy died away, leaving only silence. Blake walked out with her head high. "At least give me a moment to straighten my uniform," she said, smoothing the black fabric with steady hands. She took extra care with her collar, making sure the Earth insignia caught the light just right. The central plaza stretched before them, its ancient stones worn smooth by countless feet over millennia. A simple platform rose from the center, its surface bare except for a single metal ring that gleamed dully in the morning light. Hundreds of observers lined the surrounding terraces, their whispers carrying on the wind like dead leaves. Some looked away when Blake passed, while others stared with undisguised curiosity. Kronos stood at the head of the platform, his elaborate robes rustling in the cool breeze. Next to him, Atlas shifted uneasily, his massive frame tense beneath his ceremonial armor. The young guard's eyes darted between Blake and the crowd, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. His fingers drummed nervously against his leg, breaking protocol. "Proceed with the sentence," Kronos commanded, but his voice wavered slightly. He gripped his staff tighter to hide the tremor in his hands. Blake mounted the steps without assistance, ignoring the offered hand of a guard. Thanatos' recording crystals hummed louder, capturing every detail of her measured stride, the set of her jaw, the flash of determination in her eyes. The crystals spun faster, drinking in the moment. A small group of younger species huddled together near the platform's base. A young Drachnid child clutched his mother's hand, his scales shimmering with distress. His tail curled tightly around her leg as he watched with wide golden eyes. "The accused will speak her final words," Kronos announced, following protocol that stretched back centuries. The words felt hollow in his mouth. Blake turned to face the crowd. "You think this ends here?" That my death will silence those who question your authority? Her voice carried clearly across the plaza, strong and unwavering. But humanity doesn't work that way. We don't forget. We don't back down. Her lips curved in a slight smile that sent chills down many spines. Kronos felt his heart clench. In all his years of service, he'd never heard such certainty in a condemned voice. Atlas's hand tightened on his ceremonial staff until his knuckles went white, every instinct telling him to intervene, but tradition held him rigid. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. "Let the sentence be carried out," Kronos said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He couldn't meet Blake's eyes. The executioner stepped forward, raising an ornate device that hummed with ancient power. The air crackled with energy around its tip. Blake stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the future only she could see, a slight smile still playing on her lips. A flash of light, swift and final. Ambassador Catherine Blake's body crumpled gracefully to the platform's surface. Her uniform remained perfectly straight, just as she'd arranged it. The crowd dispersed in silence, their footsteps echoing across the empty plaza. Many walked quickly, as if afraid to linger. Kronos remained, staring at the platform where Blake had stood moments before. Thanatos' crystals continued their quiet song, recording the heavy silence that followed, and the first whispers of what was to come. The final echoes of the execution faded, yet something had shifted in the air. Kronos, returning to the high chamber, expected a return to order, to protocol, but instead, silence greeted him. No human envoys, no diplomatic signals, no presence. The absence spoke louder than any protest ever could. Kronos' footsteps echoed through the marble halls, each step resonating like a drumbeat of duty. He made his way back to the high chamber, his chest heavy with a mix of resolution and doubt. Straightening his shoulders, he pushed aside the nagging uncertainty about Blake's execution. The ancient protocols had been followed to the letter. Order would be maintained, no matter the cost. He settled into his ceremonial chair, the cold stone a stark contrast to the warmth of his robes. Clearing his throat, he addressed the chamber. "Let us proceed with today's agenda. First item, trade route expansions in the Outer Rim." The chamber remained oddly quiet, the usual hum of discussion replaced by a palpable tension. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting around the room. "First speaker," a junior aide rushed forward holding a data pad. His voice was urgent, his breath coming in quick gasps. "We've lost contact with the Earth delegation. Their offices are empty." Kronos frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Empty? What do you mean empty?" "They've gone dark, sir. No response to any communications. It's like they've just vanished." Before Kronos could respond, Nexus burst through the chamber doors. His silver scales reflected the chamber's soft light, casting shimmering patterns on the walls. "First speaker, we have a situation. Every human trading post has ceased operations. Their ships, they're powering down at all our stations." "Powering down?" Kronos leaned forward, his grip tightening on the armrests. "Explain." "They're just stopping. Going silent. No warnings, no demands. They're still there, but they won't respond to hails. It's happening everywhere, all at once." Another aide rushed in, her face pale. "Sir, reports from the Centauri sector. All human diplomatic channels have gone dark. Same in the Orion belt. And the Perseus arm." Kronos felt his skin grow cold, a shiver running down his spine. "How many stations?" "All of them," Nexus said quietly, his eyes scanning the data pad as it beeped again. "Every single human contact point across concordate space has stopped transmitting. It's like they've all just switched off." Thanatos, still recording from his corner, moved closer. His mechanical eyes whirred as they adjusted focus, capturing every moment of the unfolding chaos. "Impossible," one of the elder council members huffed, his scales bristling. "No species can coordinate such a response without central command. The humans don't even have a unified government." "And yet," Nexus said, his voice steady despite the turmoil. "We're getting reports of human vessels locking down trade routes in the Carina sector. They're not attacking. They're just stopping, blocking paths, refusing to move." The chamber erupted in confused murmurs, the council members turning to each other with worried expressions. Kronos raised his hand for silence, but his usual commanding presence seemed diminished, his voice less steady. "Call an emergency session," he ordered, his voice rough with a mix of concern and determination. "Now." As warning alerts continued to flash across the chamber's screens, Kronos couldn't shake the memory of Blake's final words. "You don't understand humans at all." Perhaps she had been right. Perhaps they had underestimated the humans and now they were witnessing the consequences of their misjudgment. The thought sent a chill through him, settling deep in his bones. The future of the Concordat suddenly seemed very uncertain. As the emergency session erupted in speculation, Nexus sifted through disrupted trade logs with growing unease. The silence of humanity was not passive, it was precise. The great Meridian freighters that once pulsed through Concordat space stood idle, their systems locked in an unyielding stasis. This was no mere diplomatic protest. This was a calculated strangulation. Nexus hovered over the holographic display, his elongated fingers twitching as another red warning light blinked into existence. The trade route map looked like a dying star system, whole sections going dark as human-operated stations shut down one after another. His antennae drooped with each new alert that flashed across the screen. "Impossible," he muttered, watching as a Meridian freighter's distress beacon activated near the Carina sector. They can't have planned this far ahead. But even as he said it, he knew he was wrong. The coordination was too perfect, too well orchestrated. His communication panel chimed. First speaker Kronos' stern face appeared, his scales looking particularly dull with worry. "Report, Trademaster Nexus. What is the extent of the disruption?" "Bad. Very bad." Nexus pulled up the latest figures, his hands shaking slightly. 47% of our major supply routes are already compromised. The humans didn't just stop working, they locked down everything. Their automated systems are refusing to service our ships. Even the vending machines won't give us a snack. Surely there are override protocols? We tried that. Nexus's skin flushed a deeper shade of blue with embarrassment. 3 of our best tech teams attempted to bypass the human security systems. Each time the station's defense protocols activated, one ship nearly had its engine core fried. They're lucky they made it back with just burned circuits. A string of urgent messages flooded his screen, piling up like debris in a solar wind. Nexus read them quickly, his heart sinking. First speaker, I'm getting reports that even our alternate routes are failing. The humans, they built backdoors into everything they touched. Every system, every station, right down to the bathroom door controls. That's not possible, Kronos interrupted, mandibles clicking in agitation. They're a younger species. They couldn't have. They did, Nexus said flatly, and we never noticed. We were so busy looking down on them, we missed how deeply they'd embedded themselves into our infrastructure, like parasites, except they were actually holding everything together. He watched another trade route turn red. A luxury cruise liner, filled with elder race tourists, was stranded without fuel. A mining operation in the Orion sector had gone silent. 3 medical supply ships were stuck in orbit around a human station, their precious cargo spoiling. The complaints were piling up faster than space junk in low orbit. First speaker, Nexus said, encoding a private message channel, his fingers moving with practiced speed. We cannot ignore this. The humans didn't just build these systems, they built them to fail safely. No catastrophic accidents, no loss of life. Just total paralysis of our trade network. They're giving us a timeout like misbehaving children. You sound almost admiring, Kronos said sharply. I'm being realistic. We thought they were simple laborers, but look at this. Nexus transmitted the latest data. They planned for every contingency. Every workaround we've tried was anticipated. They're not just blocking us, they're doing it with an efficiency that—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That we should have noticed long ago. We were too proud to see what was right in front of us." The silence stretched between them, heavy as a neutron star. Finally, Nexus sent his coded assessment. First speaker, the Concordat cannot survive an extended trade embargo. The humans knew exactly where to hit us. Either we address their demands or watch our economy crumble, and frankly, I'm not sure we have as much time to decide as they're giving us. Nexus's report sent ripples of unease through the high chamber, but Kronos already knew. The Concordat's grip was slipping. As the council gathered for an emergency war session, tension bristled among the elder races. The question was no longer whether to respond, but how much force was necessary before the humans yielded, or worse, before they retaliated. In the High Chamber's War Council chamber, Kronos gripped the edges of his podium, his scaled fingers leaving deep marks in the ancient wood. The emergency session had dragged on for hours, and the tension in the room felt thick enough to cut. His old joints ached from standing so long, but protocol demanded it. The humans must be made to understand their place. Elder Marius of the Sentinels growled, his crystalline form pulsing with angry red light that cast eerie shadows on the walls. "A swift deployment of our battle fleet will—" "Will what?" Kronos interrupted, his voice sharp and tired. "Provoke a species that has just demonstrated unprecedented unity across 12 star systems? The same species that coordinated this response in mere days?" Atlas stood silently in the corner, his armor gleaming under the chamber's lights, fingers drumming nervously on his ceremonial belt. Thanatos continued his endless recording, his many eyes taking in every detail of this historic session, mandibles clicking softly. "First speaker," a Meridian representative called out, her silver skin reflecting the emergency lights like a disco ball. "Our trading vessels are stranded. 3 of our colonies report critical resource shortages. We cannot allow this economic terrorism. My people are suffering." Kronos closed his eyes briefly, feeling every one of his many years. The word terrorism felt wrong, almost laughable. The humans hadn't attacked anyone. They'd simply stopped. Stopped trading, stopped talking, stopped cooperating. Like a child giving the silent treatment, except this child had teeth. How had they coordinated such a complete withdrawal without any central command structure the Concordat could detect? "Perhaps," Kronos suggested carefully, trying to keep his voice level, "we should open diplomatic channels." "Diplomatic channels?" Elder Marius scoffed, his crystalline body now practically strobing with fury. "We executed their ambassador. That was our diplomatic statement. Or did you forget Blake's head rolling across this very floor?" The chamber erupted in overlapping voices, a cacophony of different species all shouting at once. Atlas shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his weapon, eyes darting between the arguing council members. "Order!" Kronos called out, activating the chamber's resonance field. The voices died down like a switch had been flipped. "We must vote. The motion before us is to deploy Sentinel forces to key trade nodes as a show of strength. Those in favor?" Lights began to appear on the voting display, each one making Kronos' stomach twist harder. He watched with growing dread as the tally climbed. When the final count appeared, his heart sank like stones. "Motion carries," he announced heavily, tasting bile. "Atlas, you will coordinate with the Sentinel fleet. Secure critical trade nodes and prepare for—" A junior aide burst into the chamber, breaking centuries of protocol, his face pale and sweating. "First speaker, we've lost contact with the Sentinel outpost in the Orion sector. All communications are dead." The chamber fell silent, the kind of silence that feels like a scream. In that silence, Kronos realized they had gravely miscalculated. Again, the humans weren't just giving them the silent treatment, they were showing their teeth. As fleets mobilized to enforce the High Chamber's decision, Thanatos walked the empty halls of the human embassy, the silence pressing against him like a phantom. Terminals flickered with encrypted logs, evidence of preparations that stretched back decades. The humans had never been at the mercy of Concordat rule. They had simply waited for the right moment to slip the leash. The human embassy stood silent, its gleaming walls now dulled by emptiness. Thanatos moved through the hallways, his footsteps echoing in spaces that just days ago buzzed with activity. Light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across abandoned desks and forgotten coffee cups. A half-eaten sandwich sat molding on one desk, evidence of how quickly the humans had departed. He placed his hand on a desk surface, finding a thin layer of dust already settling. Papers rustled under his touch, scattering to the floor. "Computer, access diplomatic archives," he commanded. The system hummed to life, screens flickering with a blue glow. "Access granted. Warning, partial data corruption detected." Thanatos knew better. The corruption was too precise, too selective. The humans had deliberately scrubbed certain files while leaving others intact, like leaving breadcrumbs in a forest. As he dug deeper into the remaining records, a pattern emerged, clear as day. Trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, scientific collaborations. But hidden within these mundane documents were careful notes about technological suppressions, recorded testimonies from younger species about exploitation, and detailed maps of resource monopolies held by elder races. Each file seemed innocent enough alone, but together they painted a damning picture. A holographic recording flickered to life on one terminal, casting an eerie blue light across the room. A junior human diplomat spoke in hushed tones, constantly looking over his shoulder. Ambassador Blake's assessment confirmed. "The Meridian trade routes are completely dependent on our refueling stations. Operation Deadlock protocols have been distributed to all colonial outposts." Thanatos' hands trembled as he accessed another file, knocking over an empty coffee mug. This one showed Blake herself, speaking privately to her staff in her characteristic direct manner. "If anything happens to me, remember, we're not just fighting for Earth. Every younger species deserves a voice. The evidence is secured. The network is ready." Her eyes burned with determination, even in the recording. Moving to the embassy's central command room, Thanatos discovered more. Star charts marked with alternative trade routes glowed on wall-sized screens. Lists of allies among the younger species filled entire databases. Detailed analyses of concordant military response protocols sat in seemingly innocent folders marked cultural studies. The humans hadn't just prepared for conflict. They'd spent years building a complete understanding of how the Concordat operated. They'd created backup plans, established secret communication channels, and positioned themselves at critical points throughout the galaxy. Like master chess players, they'd set up every piece perfectly. His communicator chimed, making him jump. "Report," Kronos' voice commanded. Thanatos stared at the evidence before him, his throat dry. First speaker, the humans. They knew. They anticipated everything. Ambassador Blake's execution wasn't just a tragedy, it was a trigger they were prepared for. "Explain," Kronos said sharply, tension evident in his voice. "They mapped our weaknesses, built alliances, created fail-safes." Thanatos paused, looking at a final document, a manifesto calling for equal rights for all species. They weren't just protecting themselves, they were planning to change everything. Silence filled the channel before Kronos spoke again, his words heavy with worry. "Return to the chamber. Bring everything you've found." Thanatos gathered the critical files into his datapad. As he walked toward the embassy's exit, he passed Blake's former office. Through the window, he could see the plaza where she'd been executed, the cleaning bot still scrubbing at the stains. His voice barely a whisper, he said, "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." A chill ran down his spine as he realized just how right he was. Beyond the illusion of stillness, the first moves had already begun. Atlas's sentinels, enforcers of Concordat will, arrived at key trade stations, expecting swift compliance. Instead, they were met with quiet defiance, dormant systems that roared to life, repurposed mining lasers and drone swarms standing in their way. The blockade was not passive. It was a battlefield waiting to be tested. Atlas stood on the command deck of his flagship, watching as the Sentinel fleet approached the Centauri trade hub. The massive station hung against the starfield like a steel flower, its petals made of docking arms and storage pods. Maintenance lights blinked along its surface, giving it a deceptively peaceful appearance. "First wave, move in," he ordered. "Standard containment formation. Keep your distance until we've assessed their defenses." The sleek Sentinel vessels glided forward, their weapons powered down to avoid appearing hostile. Through the view screen, Atlas noticed something odd. The station's mining arrays were rotating, tracking their movement. Their targeting sensors, meant for breaking up asteroids, now moved with an unsettling purpose. "Sir," his tactical officer called out, voice cracking. "Those mining lasers, they're not in maintenance position. The power readings are off the charts." Before Atlas could respond, the harmless mining equipment erupted in a coordinated barrage. Precise beams sliced through the lead vessel's shields, cutting deep gashes in its hull. The ship's atmosphere vented into space in brilliant streams of frozen gas. "Evasive action," Atlas commanded. "Get us out of their firing arc." But as his ship scattered, swarms of cargo drones burst from the station's holds. The simple machines, normally used for moving containers, now carried makeshift explosive packages. Their engines had been stripped down and overclocked, making them dart through space like angry wasps. Nexus's hologram flickered beside Atlas, the Meridian's usual calm demeanor shaken. "They've modified everything," the trader said, his voice tight with worry. "Those are standard cargo handlers, but they've stripped them down for speed and loaded them with mining charges. Look at how they move. That's not standard programming." The drones darted between the Sentinel ships, too small and numerous to target effectively. Explosions bloomed across his fleet's formation as the improvised bombs found their marks. Several smaller vessels spun out of control, their hulls breached. "Atlas," Kronos' stern hologram appeared, his ancient features twisted with concern. "Report. Why haven't you secured the station?" A massive explosion rocked Atlas's flagship as a support beam, superheated by mining lasers, gave way. The deck lurched beneath his feet. "First speaker, they've turned the entire station into a weapon. Every piece of civilian equipment has been repurposed for defense. They're using maintenance bots as boarding parties." Through the chaos, Atlas watched in dismay as several of his ships lost power, their systems corrupted by maintenance protocols that humans had apparently modified into devastating computer attacks. The infected vessels drifted helplessly, their crews scrambling to restore basic life support. "Impossible," Kronos muttered, his hologram flickering as interference increased. "They're using mining tools and cargo drones." "No, sir," Atlas replied, ducking as sparks showered from a damaged console. "They're using weapons they built from mining tools and cargo drones. There's a difference. They've turned every bolt and wire into a trap." Another Sentinel cruiser fell dark, its engines dead. The cargo drone swarms regrouped, forming attack patterns that no civilian programming should have been capable of. They moved like schools of predatory fish, striking from multiple angles. "All ships withdraw," Atlas ordered, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. He turned to Kronos' hologram. "First speaker, we must abort. The humans, they haven't just fortified these stations, they've transformed them. Continuing this attack will only result in more losses." As his battered fleet retreated, Atlas composed a priority message to the High Chamber. "Urgent. Human defensive capabilities far exceed projections. They have converted standard equipment into lethal countermeasures. Recommend immediate reassessment of military options. Direct confrontation inadvisable. Risk of severe escalation high. They've weaponized their entire infrastructure. Repeat, all civilian equipment compromised." He watched the station shrink in the distance, its innocent-looking exterior now revealed as a carefully crafted illusion. The humans hadn't just prepared for a fight. They'd turned their entire infrastructure into a hidden arsenal. And this was just one station. Atlas shuddered to think what other surprises they had waiting across their territory. As the Sentinels reeled from their unexpected resistance, the undercurrents of rebellion spread beyond human-held sectors. On distant homeworlds, emboldened voices whispered of change, of defiance. To the younger species long held under the Concordate's rule, humanity was no longer just a species. It was a spark, igniting something long thought impossible. On the Meridian homeworld, Helios stood by the window of the diplomatic training center, watching elder officials hurry through the crystalline corridors. The usual calm of their floating cities had given way to nervous energy. Small groups huddled in corners speaking in hushed tones while casting worried glances at passing security drones. "Did you see the reports?" Another intern whispered, clutching a datapad to his chest. "The humans turned mining equipment into weapons. They're fighting back. They took out 3 enforcer ships with modified drilling lasers." Helios nodded, his heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. For centuries, the Meridians had accepted their place as a developing species under Concordate guidance. But now, everything seemed possible. The old rules were crumbling like sandcastles in a storm. In the main hall, Nexus addressed a gathering of trade representatives from various younger species. His usual focus on profit margins had been replaced by something more urgent. The normally pristine chamber buzzed with an electric tension. "The humans have shown us what's possible," Nexus said, his voice low but intense. "They've proven the Concordate's limitations aren't about safety. They're about control. Every restriction, every regulation, it's all been a carefully crafted lie." A Centaurian delegate raised her hand, her silver scales glinting under the soft lights. "We've already seen changes. 3 colonies in our sector have refused Concordate inspectors entry. They're demanding access to the same technology humans use. 2 more are threatening to follow." "It's happening everywhere," another representative added, tapping nervously on the table. "The Arcturus Federation has started manufacturing their own ships without waiting for Concordate approval. They're calling it their Independence Initiative." Helios watched as Nexus shared a knowing look with the gathered delegates. "Perhaps it's time we questioned why we need permission to advance our own civilizations. Why should we ask for rights that should have been ours from the start?" The meeting was interrupted by a soft chime from everyone's communication devices. Somehow, despite the Concordate's tight control on technology, they'd all received the same encrypted message. Helios opened it with trembling fingers, his breath catching in his throat. "To all species seeking freedom to grow, Earth stands ready to share knowledge suppressed for generations. The plans attached show just a fraction of what's possible without Concordate restrictions. Choose your future wisely. Your chains are imaginary. You just need to realize it." Included were partial designs for advanced communication systems. Nothing weapons grade, but far beyond what the Concordate allowed younger species to develop. Helios studied them in awe, realizing how much potential had been held back. The simplicity of the designs made their suppression even more infuriating. Nexus quickly organized smaller groups, each discussing how to proceed. Some colonies had already begun quiet revolts, refusing to follow Concordate technological limitations. Others were more cautious, watching Earth's example before committing. The room hummed with whispered plans and half-formed dreams of freedom. As the debates continued, Helios's device chimed again. This time, the message was meant for him alone. The words glowed with promise. "Your species has the capacity for greatness. If you're willing to step beyond artificial constraints, we can show you how to reach it. The choice is yours. Don't let fear of the unknown hold you back any longer." Helios looked around the room at his fellow Meridians, seeing the same question in their eyes. After centuries of accepting limits, were they ready to break free? The answer seemed to hang in the air like static before a storm. From the war front to the high chamber, Kronos felt the weight of the unraveling order. He stood in the grand halls of the Chiron capital, staring at the stars beyond. The humans had not struck first, yet they had wounded the Concordate more deeply than any war ever could. Thanatos entered the chamber, his words simple yet heavy. "You need to see the records." In the vast, echoing halls of the Kirin capital, Kronos stood before the towering data archives. The golden light from twin suns filtered through the crystal dome above, but it brought him no warmth. His claws clicked against the control panel as he pulled up file after file. First speaker, Thanatos' voice carried across the empty chamber. "You summoned me?" Kronos didn't turn around. "Look at this, old friend." He waved a hand at the hovering displays. Trade restrictions on the Meridians, technology embargoes on the Centauri colonies, development limitations on a dozen younger worlds. Thanatos moved closer, his recording crystals dimming. "Protocol demands." "Protocol." Kronos spat the word. "I've been reviewing Ambassador Blake's final transmission." He pulled up her image, her fierce eyes staring out from the screen. She saw what we refused to see. Every regulation, every tradition we claimed preserved harmony, they all served to keep the younger species dependent on us. The data scrolled past. Centuries of carefully worded laws, each one designed to limit growth, to control advancement. Kronos felt sick as patterns emerged, showing how elder races had grown wealthy from the deliberate suppression of others. The humans weren't just fighting for themselves, Thanatos observed quietly. They were fighting for all of them. Yes. Kronos sank into his chair. Blake knew. She gathered evidence, built alliances. When we executed her... He trailed off, remembering her final words about humanity's resolve. The younger species watched, Thanatos added. They saw one of their champions die for speaking truth. Kronos pulled up more records, reports of small uprisings, of younger species finding their voice. Humanity had shown them that resistance was possible, that the old order could be challenged. "We called it harmony," Kronos whispered, "but it was control, pure and simple." He turned to face Thanatos fully. "If we don't change, if we don't find a way to make real peace, this will end in war. And I'm no longer certain we would win." His claws moved across the console one final time, composing a message to Atlas. "We may have erred. Seek a path to negotiate." As Kronos wrestled with the ghosts of history, Atlas received a private directive: seek a path to communicate. The orders came not from the High Chamber's war-hungry faction, but from Kronos himself. So Atlas stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as a human squadron approached under a white flag protocol. Perhaps there was still a path that did not lead to war. Atlas stood on the pristine bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dawn, reading Kronos' message for the third time. His clawed hand tightened around the datapad. "Find a way to talk with them," the message urged, "before this spirals beyond our control." Through the view screen, Atlas watched the human blockade, a ragtag collection of retrofitted cargo ships and mining vessels that somehow managed to look threatening. Their makeshift weapons gleamed under the distant starlight. "Open a channel," Atlas commanded. "White flag protocols." His communications officer's antenna twitched nervously. "Sir, the humans have rejected all previous..." "Try again. Specify that I seek direct dialogue with their commander." Minutes crawled by. Finally, a gruff voice crackled through. "This is Commander Lee of Earth Forces. State your purpose." "I propose a face-to-face meeting, no weapons, no tricks, just talk." More silence, then, "Agreed. My ship, 1 hour." The meeting room on Lee's vessel was sparse and utilitarian. Commander Lee, a stocky woman with steel-gray hair and hard eyes, sat across from Atlas. Her expression gave nothing away. "The Concordat is willing to discuss partial lifting of trade restrictions," Atlas began, "in exchange for..." "No deals." Lee's voice cut like a blade. "Not until you acknowledge what you did to Ambassador Blake. Not until you admit the centuries of keeping younger species down." Atlas's scales rippled with discomfort. The High Chamber's authority was wrong. Lee leaned forward. "You executed our ambassador for telling the truth. Now you want to bargain? Earth doesn't want your concessions. We want justice." The Concordat cannot what? Admit fault? Change? Then we have nothing to discuss. Lee stood up. We're not interested in half measures, Atlas. Either the Concordat evolves or it breaks. Your choice. Atlas rose slowly. You realize the Sentinels could what? Fight us? Lee's laugh was bitter. Go ahead. But ask yourself, is preserving the old way worth the cost? We don't want to destroy the Concordat. We want to fix it. As Atlas returned to his ship, he felt strangely relieved. The humans weren't seeking vengeance. They wanted change. Real change, not compromises. He would tell Kronos there was still hope for peace, but it would require more courage than warfare. The attempt at negotiation had failed, but the true battle had yet to begin. Far from the war councils and trade routes, hidden among Jupiter's moons, Earth's greatest secret remained unseen. There, in the silent void, a fleet unlike any before it stood ready, crafted from the knowledge of dozens of species, forged with purpose, waiting for the inevitable reckoning. Behind Jupiter's largest moon, Callisto, a vast network of shipyards stretched across the void. The structures glinted in the dim sunlight, their metal frames housing hundreds of vessels that would have made any Concordat inspector's jaw drop. Helios pressed his face against the observation window, his crystalline eyes wide. The human escort beside him smiled at his reaction. Impressive, isn't it? Admiral Torres asked, her weathered face proud. Each ship combines technology from at least 3 different species. We learned from everyone, even those who thought they were keeping their secrets. In the massive hangar below, engineers swarmed over a sleek destroyer. Its hull gleamed with an iridescent coating that Helios recognized from Meridian stealth ships. But the weapon mounts were clearly adapted from Sentinel designs, and the engine configuration, he'd never seen anything like it. How did you... Helios trailed off, watching teams of humans working in perfect sync. We're good at putting pieces together, Torres said. When you're told you can't have something, you get creative. Through another viewport, Helios saw a heated discussion taking place in the command center. Admiral Chen pounded his fist on the table while Commander Rodriguez shook her head. The blockade is working, Rodriguez insisted, her voice carrying through the speakers. We don't need to show our hand yet. Every day we wait gives them time to prepare, Chen argued. We should strike now, fast and hard. Show them exactly what we can do. Helios watched crews from different nations seamlessly coordinating their efforts. A Japanese engineer adjusted shield harmonics while her Brazilian colleague calibrated the weapons. A Nigerian pilot ran simulation drills with his Canadian weapons officer. Your people work together so naturally, Helios observed. In the Concordat, different factions constantly compete. Torres nodded. That's our strength. We argue, we debate. But when it matters, we stand as one. The Concordat never understood that about us. A massive carrier slowly rotated in its dock, revealing rows of fighters unlike anything in known space. They combined the maneuverability of Meridian scouts with the firepower of Sentinel gunships, an impossible merger that somehow worked. We have over 300 ships ready, Torres said quietly. Each one crewed by the best Earth has to offer. Every nation contributed something, technology, tactics, or pure determination. Helios felt his heart racing. The Concordat had no idea. They thought humans were just being stubborn with their blockade. They hadn't guessed that Earth had built this. He watched the admirals continue their debate, saw the crews running drills with practiced efficiency, observed the impossible ships that proved humans could do what the elder races thought couldn't be done. I need to tell Nexus, Helios whispered. He needs to know what's coming. Torres placed a hand on his shoulder. Tell him this. We're ready, more ready than anyone could have imagined. The question isn't if we can win, it's whether the Concordat is wise enough to talk before we have to prove it. As Helios departed the shipyards, the truth of Earth's preparations weighed on him like a prophecy fulfilled. When his report reached the high chamber, the reaction was instant. Panic, disbelief, fury. The elder races had miscalculated at every turn. Now, war was not a question of possibility. It was a certainty. In the High Chamber's Grand Hall, Kronos' hands trembled as he read the intelligence report. The holographic display showed hundreds of human warships, each bristling with hybrid technology that shouldn't have been possible. "How?" asked a Sentinel elder, his voice cracking. "They're barely spacefaring by our standards." Thanatos stepped forward, his recording devices whirring. They pieced it together, took scraps of knowledge from a dozen worlds, combined them in ways we never imagined. Atlas's hologram flickered to life in the center of the chamber. First speaker, the human fleet. It's not just their ships. Every vessel shows signs of multiple species engineering. They've unified technologies we kept separate for centuries. Kronos felt sick. They had all assumed humans were just another young, isolated species. But while the Concordat maintained careful barriers between civilizations, humanity had been building bridges. Across the chamber, warhawks were already shouting for immediate action. "Strike now," bellowed Council Member Erebus, "before they can deploy." "Wait," Kronos pleaded, raising his hands. "We must attempt negotiations. Ambassador Blake's execution was justified." Erebus cut him off. "And now we see why these humans were so dangerous. Look at how they've corrupted our order." On a secure channel, Nexus's voice reached Kronos. "The younger species are rising up everywhere. Trade stations, mining colonies, even some core worlds. They're all citing Earth's example." Meanwhile, in a hidden corner of the Meridian Embassy, Helios rushed to transmit his findings to his people. "They've done it," he whispered into an encrypted channel. "Humans have achieved what we thought impossible. They've broken the chains of progress the elders placed on us all." The chamber erupted into chaos as more reports flooded in. Sentinel fleets were already mobilizing near major trade routes. Human ships had begun moving into defensive formations around their colonies. Kronos called for order, his voice nearly breaking. "I move for an emergency negotiation session. We can still prevent." The vote was swift and brutal, 28 against, only 3 for peace. As the war drums began to beat, Kronos slumped in his chair, watching the galaxy spiral toward conflict. He thought of Blake's final warning, her eyes fierce with conviction. Now he understood. "One death," he whispered, staring at the tactical displays showing fleets gathering across the stars. "And now 1,000 worlds tremble." The fleets of the Concordat converged at the threshold of Earth's outer colonies, the tension in the void thick as a storm about to break. Across the battlefield, human vessels did not move to strike first, but neither did they retreat. Then, without warning, the first salvo was fired. The war had begun. The massive Concordat fleet emerged from hyperspace like a wall of steel and light. Atlas stood on his command deck, watching as hundreds of Elder Race warships spread across the starfield. Ahead, the human defense force seemed tiny in comparison. Barely 50 ships arranged in a loose sphere around the jump point. "Their formation is irregular," his tactical officer noted. "No clear battle line." Atlas frowned. Something felt wrong about the humans' scattered positioning. "All ships, advance at half thrust. Maintain tight formation." As the Concordat armada pushed forward, the human vessels began to move, but instead of retreating, they darted between the dense asteroid fields that dotted the region. Their smaller ships wove through the rocks with startling precision. "Sir," an officer called out, "they're using mining lasers to—" Before he could finish, brilliant beams lanced out from multiple human ships, striking nearby asteroids. The rocks didn't explode. They shattered into thousands of smaller pieces, creating an expanding cloud of debris that forced several Concordat vessels to alter course. "Clever," Atlas muttered. "They're using the environment as a weapon." Commander Lee's voice crackled over the command channel. "This is your only warning, Sentinel. Withdraw your forces." Atlas watched as human ships executed lightning-fast course changes that should have torn their hulls apart. They'd somehow modified their inertial dampeners beyond standard specs. More asteroids fractured under precise laser fire, herding concordate ships into uncomfortable positions. "Sir, detecting energy spikes." His sensor officer's voice rose in alarm. "The humans. They've rigged their cargo drones with pulse generators." Dozens of small automated drones previously hidden among the debris activated at once. The electromagnetic pulses they released weren't powerful enough to cripple concordate ships, but they scrambled sensors and targeting systems. In the confusion, human vessels struck with surgical precision. They didn't aim to destroy. Instead, they disabled engines and weapons with carefully placed shots. 3 concordate cruisers drifted powerless, their crews intact but helpless. "They're not trying to kill us," Atlas realized aloud. "They want us to back down." From his observation post, Thanatos documented everything: how the humans used supposedly primitive mining equipment as tactical assets, how they turned cargo drones into electronic warfare platforms. Most importantly, he noted their restraint, their clear attempt to avoid unnecessary casualties. After 2 hours of humiliating losses without a single human ship destroyed, Atlas made his decision. "All vessels, fall back to safe distance. Maintain defensive positions only." As the concordate fleet retreated, Nexus's trade monitors showed the ripple effects. Markets across 3 sectors plunged as news spread. The mighty elder races had failed to break Earth's blockade. In the high chamber, Kronos watched the battle recordings in stunned silence. The humans hadn't just fought back. They'd completely outmaneuvered the Concordate's best tacticians using tools that weren't even designed for combat. "All ships hold position," Atlas commanded his battered fleet. "We need to reassess our entire approach." The battle had been won, but the true war was still unfolding. Not in the void, but in the halls of the high chamber. As Kronos reviewed the aftermath, he found himself drawn to an old archive. A recording, one he had ignored for too long. Blake's final words echoed through the chamber, a voice that had refused to be silenced. The past, it seemed, had never stopped speaking. In the dim light of the high chamber archives, Kronos sat alone, his scaled fingers hovering over the holographic controls. The recent battle's devastating losses weighed heavily on his ancient shoulders. With a gentle touch, he activated the recording. Ambassador Blake's image flickered to life before him. Her eyes burned with the same fierce determination he remembered from her final days. "The Concordate speaks of harmony." Blake's recorded voice rang clear and strong. "But what kind of harmony silences the voices of those who seek truth?" Thanatos entered quietly, his data-gathering instruments humming softly. He found Kronos transfixed by the human's words. "Look at how they stand together," Kronos murmured, watching another recording of Blake addressing a gathering of younger species. One voice, one death, and now they move as one force. "The humans process grief differently than we do," Thanatos observed. To them, Ambassador Blake wasn't just a diplomatic casualty, she became a symbol. Kronos's hands trembled as he switched to footage from Blake's final speech. "We believed ending her life would quiet dissent. Instead," he shook his head, unable to finish. "Perhaps," Thanatos suggested, stepping closer. "It's time we approached humans as equals, not as children to be disciplined. Their response to Blake's execution proves they're far more sophisticated than we assumed." Blake's voice echoed through the archive chamber again. "Earth won't bow to injustice. We'll stand against it, whatever the cost." "She knew," Kronos whispered. "She knew her death would unite them." He rose slowly from his seat, his ancient frame bearing the weight of responsibility. "Summon the high chamber. A private session." "The elder races won't be pleased," Thanatos warned. "They'll be less pleased if their stubbornness leads to more battles like today's," Kronos replied, moving toward the chamber hall. The massive doors swung open, revealing the gathered elder race leaders, their faces tight with anger and fear. As Kronos stepped inside, the doors sealed behind him with a heavy thud. Around the circular chamber, The collected leaders of the oldest species in known space fixed him with cold, disapproving stares. As the echoes of Blake's message settled in his mind, Kronos walked into a chamber divided. The high chamber, once a beacon of unity, now fractured before his eyes. Some called for total war, others for surrender. But Kronos had already made his choice. He turned to Atlas and spoke quietly. "It's time to end this." The grand doors of the high chamber sealed with a heavy thud. Kronos stood at the central podium, his ancient eyes sweeping over the gathered counselors. The room crackled with tension. "We cannot ignore the reality before us," Kronos said, his voice steady but tired. "Our forces suffered heavy losses at the jump point." Elder Counselor Moro slammed his fist on the ornate table. "Because we hesitated, we should have crushed them immediately after the execution." Atlas stood near the tactical display, shaking his head. "The humans adapt faster than any species we've encountered. Every engagement teaches them more about our weaknesses." "They are vermin," Moro spat. "Nothing more." Nexus adjusted his trade council insignia. "The economic impact is spreading. 3 more species have joined Earth's embargo. Our supply chains—" "Silence, merchant," another counselor snapped. "This is about power, not credits." Kronos raised his hands, but the chamber erupted into shouting. Accusations flew like missiles. "Kronos' weakness brought us here. No, your bloodlust caused this crisis. We should never have let humans into the Concordat." The doors burst open. A delegation of younger species representatives entered, their spokesperson's voice ringing clear. "We stand with Earth." Moros and his faction shot to their feet, faces twisted in rage. "Treason! We will crush all opposition." "Then you do so without us," Kronos said quietly, but his words cut through the chaos. "I will not lead the Concordat into a war we cannot win." "Coward," Moros pointed a trembling finger. "Then we will form our own coalition, one that remembers its strength." Nearly half the Elder Council stormed out behind him. The chamber sat in stunned silence. Kronos turned to Atlas. "How many ships remain loyal?" "Perhaps half," Atlas admitted, "but more crews desert daily." "Then we must sue for peace," Kronos said, looking at the now empty seats, "before this war tears the galaxy apart." While the high chamber splintered, humanity worked in silence. Behind Jupiter's largest moon, the massive hangar bay hummed with activity. Engineers scurried around a sleek vessel, its frame pulsing with an ethereal blue glow. Commander Lee stood on the observation deck, watching as final calibrations were made to the convergence drive. "It's beautiful," Helios whispered, his meridian features reflecting the glow. "We never imagined combining meridian particle physics with Centaurian wave theory could yield such results." "Because the elder races kept us apart," Lee replied. "They thought chaos would follow if we shared knowledge. Instead, look what happened when we worked together." A secure transmission crackled through. Nexus's voice, tense with disbelief. "This energy signature, it's unlike anything in Concordat records. You've done the impossible." Lee nodded. "The question now isn't whether it works, it's how we use it." In the command center, Admiral Chen slammed her hand on the table. "Blake's execution demands a response. With this drive, we could strike their capital before they even knew what hit them." "That's what they expect," another officer countered. "Violence, revenge, we can be better." Helios stepped forward. "Ambassador Blake didn't die for revenge. She died fighting for justice. For all of us." The room fell silent. Lee glanced at the convergence drive, its core spinning faster, light dancing across the walls. "We use this to position our fleet in a way that makes war pointless, not to destroy the Concordat, but to force them to rebuild it. Fairly, for everyone." The vote was nearly unanimous. As the drive was installed across the fleet, Lee caught Helios watching, his eyes glistening. "This is what Blake saw," Helios murmured. "Not just humanity rising up, but all of us together." The human fleet materialized above the Karen capital in perfect formation, their ships gleaming with the eerie glow of the convergence drive. Kronos stood at the high chamber's panoramic window, breath catching at the sight. Hundreds of vessels, weapons primed but not firing, formed an impenetrable wall around the Concordate's seat of power. "Impossible," a militant elder hissed. "They shouldn't have this technology." Atlas studied the human positioning. "They're not attacking," he murmured. "They're containing us." The militant fleet attempted to break through. Beams of energy lanced from human vessels, disabling weapons and engines with surgical precision. Ships drifted, powerless but unharmed. "This is Commander Lee of the Earth Fleet," a calm voice echoed through all channels. "Your offensive capabilities are neutralized. There will be no further bloodshed if you stand down." Kronos stepped to the communicator. "I speak as first speaker of what remains of the Concordate. The death of Ambassador Blake was a grave error. We are prepared to listen." Lee's voice was firm. "The terms are non-negotiable. Equal representation for all species. No more suppression of knowledge. No more exploitation of younger races." The militant elders raged, but their protests fell flat. One by one, their ships fell silent. "We accept," Kronos declared. "The old Concordate is dead. Let us build something better from its ashes." Thanatos, watching from the human flagship, recorded his final log. The humans defied expectations again. They wielded power without destruction, strength without vengeance. The war had ended, but its shadow stretched long into the years that followed. Now, as Helios walked the halls of the new Galactic Assembly, he saw change in every law, every face. The statue at the entrance bore no triumphant inscription, just a single phrase. "One voice can move the stars." And humanity had proven it true. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.